Ladies and gentlemen, that was a very polite way of Vassy saying to Mark Carney and Melanie Joly, "Are you stupid?" Mark Carney is forced to capitulate on the EV mandate. Melanie Joly is pressed on her sudden reversal of China. And conservatives are asking a blunt question. Why is Mark Carney's plan helping the United States and not Canada? Let's take a look.
The government says they'll scrap the electric vehicle sales mandate, another Trudeau-era environmental policy now gone. Instead, they're promising new emission standards to be detailed in the future. And rebates are returning, with the government launching a 5-year EV affordability program to the tune of $2.3 billion. The rebate is $5,000 for EVs, $2,500 for plug-in hybrids. The rebates apply to vehicles not just made in Canada, but in countries we have free trade deals with. Ontario Premier Doug Ford was absent from the Fed's announcement, but in his own press conference was asked if he'd consider provincial EV rebates.
We took a different approach. I remember when I first got elected, we were giving rebates to millionaires that were buying $100,000 Teslas. We decided to take a different approach. We invested billions of dollars into domestic-made cars, and the Prime Minister wants to support incentives. By all means, whatever it takes to protect our auto workers.
Melanie Joly is the Federal Minister of Industry. Hi, Minister. Pleasure, as always, to welcome you back to the program. Thank you for making the time.
Thank you.
The new strategy that you and the Prime Minister announced today appears to be all in on EVs. How can you be sure, given the volatility in the North American market and your government's history with that sector, that it's the right decision?
Well, first and foremost, it is all in for automaking in Canada. So it is supporting Toyota, Honda, that are producing 77% of all our auto production, obviously in Canada. It is to support also those working in Windsor, in Oakville, in Oshawa. So it is first and foremost a Buy Canada policy. And then, of course, we also believe that the future of the industry is EV. Why? Because by 2035, we know that 40% of EVs, the cars sold in the world will be EVs. We know that. And so, while it is happening in Europe, it is happening in Asia and Latin America, everywhere. The only place in the world where that has not really been happening as much is really North America. But we know that that's the trend. And so, while other countries are taking their own decisions, and while we can't control what's going on in Washington, we need to make sure that we embrace progress. It is our promise to auto workers that they will continue to have great jobs in the future, and so that's why we're also investing in electrification.
And we're off. Okay, Joly, so here's the problem. Well, let's just give credit where credit is due. So number one, they got rid of the EV mandate, right? So, it's kind of like applauding an arsonist for not setting a building on fire, I guess. Maybe that's how I would describe this. But at least they're not going through with it, right? Because that would have been an utter disaster for the auto industry in Canada and the used car market in Canada, as we've talked about this before. So that's a good thing. It's a good thing. But for her to say, well, we know 40% of all EVs are going to, or all vehicles are going to be, EVs you don't know that. You don't. Because you knew that 100% of EVs in Canada or 100% of cars sold in Canada were going to be EVs by 2035. Remember that? You knew that. Things change. And Canada is very different. And what the Liberals will do is they will say, well, Europe. Here's the problem. You can point to Denmark, you can point to Finland, you can point to Sweden. Because there's lots of arguments, valid ones, about EVs performing worse in the cold. And Canada is a cold country. And liberals will say, but Finland, but Denmark, but Sweden, but the Scandinavian countries. But the Scandinavian countries are a fraction of the size of Canada. We all know this. Canada is a largely rural country. Lots of our population lives in cities, that's true. But lots of our population also lives in rural areas. And even people in cities. Not all of them work in the cities. A lot of them have to travel longer distances in order to actually get to their work. And EVs aren't really the job for that. Never mind work trucks. So let's just get that out there right now. So the fact that they're saying, well, you know, we know. No, we don't know. We don't know. And you have companies that are actually pulling back on EV production rather than going forward. And she says, Latin America. Well, EVs perform at their best in warmer temperatures. So I don't want to hear about Latin America. And neither do people that live in Prince Edward Island, Yukon, Alberta, Northern Ontario. You know what? Anywhere in Canada.
Certainly, I understand the motivation, right? And I wouldn't try to say that your government wants anything other than to make sure the sector is around. But I also think part of my job is making sure that what you're promising will actually result in that. And when I look at the record of the Liberals in this sector, there are major challenges presented. For example, I can think back to 2022 when then the minister who occupied your portfolio at the time, François-Philippe Champagne, said, today is proof that Canada's auto sector is here for the long term. And that was when you were announcing more federal money going towards GM and Ingersoll and Oshawa. You know as well as our viewers know what has happened now. There are other examples of billions of dollars that your government promised because the EV sector was going to be the sector of the future, and things dramatically changed, and we're having trouble recouping those costs. Why in this instance should Canadians trust your government is doing something that will keep the sector alive when that has not been the case?
And I think that's a fair question. And that was the question we were struggling with, which was, you know, how can we make sure that we protect our auto base, our industrial base, and at the same time, how can we be ambitious? And that's why we were, I think, able to square the circle. Because when you look at it, after 10 years of investment, even nearly 15 years of investments in the auto sector, the biggest investments are now actually happening and hiring people, because it is what happened in Windsor with LG and Stellantis building a battery plant, and people, you know, the company is still hiring, and at a term it's 3,000 jobs. St. Thomas, so basically the Volkswagen plant in St. Thomas is being built as we speak, and it is to hire 3,000 people, and the hiring has already started. So these investments are transforming communities. At the same time, what we're doing is we're making sure that our investment in defense, particularly, I must say, submarine procurement, is able to, through submarine procurement, we're able to attract either investments from Korea or from Germany. And also, we know that there's lots of interest by Chinese companies to invest in Canada and produce cars here, but we want to make sure that auto workers are protected, so we'll favor unionization. We want to make sure that the software in these cars is also safe, and we want to make sure that there's a local supply chain, so basically our small and medium-sized businesses can support these investments. So all that to say, it is, I agree, an ambitious approach, but we also think that the North American market, Vassy, will continue to change.
I love that Joly tries to change the framing of this, where Vassy's saying, well, you guys said that, you know, this was going to happen and this was going to happen, and you gave billions and billions of dollars to auto manufacturers back in 2022, 2023, and nothing happened like you said it was going to. And she said, how can Canadians trust your government when your track record is terrible? And then Joly says all this garbage, and she says, I agree, this is ambitious. No. Vassy didn't say this was ambitious. She said, how can people trust you? And if you believe Joly, wow, They just solved every single problem. They solved the auto sector. But she ends with, China wants to invest everywhere in Canada. Everywhere? Well, you know, the auto sector. I get the impression that you're talking about more than just the auto sector. And what does it matter when all of that money goes back to China? And China hasn't even committed. They've said, well, you know, we'll think about it, but we're going to be selling tens of thousands of electric vehicles in Canada for very few tariffs. And even the tariffs that are there, and even these rebates that you're going to provide, they're still going to be undercutting all the competition because it's communist government subsidized garbage. Really?
And we think we should not be naive, and we think that there may be Chinese investments coming in the future in other parts of North America. So basically, our goal is to leapfrog what is going on in the North American market and be able to also produce the best cars in the world for the world. So basically not being hostage of our geography here in North America, but also to be able to export around the world.
I do want to ask you about the question of Chinese investment and more largely the kind of affordability pitch in allowing for 49,000, for example, Chinese EVs to enter the market. I remember when you occupied the position of Minister of Foreign Affairs and the centrality of the Indo-Pacific strategy at the time, which I think it was November of 2022 that you announced that strategy. You said that China seeks to shape the global environment at that time into one that is more permissive to interests and values that increasingly depart from ours. The China of 1970, to quote your own words, is not the China of today. China is an increasingly disruptive global power. I understand the point your government has made that the world has changed, that the United States has changed. But, Minister, with all due respect, China has not changed. Why is opening up the market to China a good idea?
Well, first and foremost, we've been victims of the U.S. trade war against us. So our goal is to make sure that we're able to find new markets. At the same time, I must say that it's eyes wide open. We made sure that we would be having guardrails in this important agreement that we've been able to sign with China. Our goal was to resolve a lot of the outstanding issues, which had to be resolved. It was important for canola farmers to be able to have access to the Chinese market, same for our fishers. But at the same time, China is investing around the world and exporting EVs around the world. It is the case in Europe. It is the case also across Asia. What we've done, I think, is something that is very unique, but we believe that it is our way to not only benefit from our great expertise, because we have some of the biggest auto parts companies in the world, Linamar, Martin Ria, Magna, which are all headquartered in Ontario. But at the same time, we think that attracting investments from Chinese automakers working in joint ventures with Canadian companies is the way to really be able to embrace this new technology that has been developed by China and that will be able to offer cheaper EVs and also quality EVs. So not a lot of jurisdictions are able to do that in the world. Magna, Canadian company, is already building for a Chinese company in Austria, Xpeng, and they're already in China. So these are just examples of what we intend to do for the Canadian market. And I think that in time, it will be good for the North American market also, but not only the North American market. I really think that because we have 51 free trade agreements with the world, we can export elsewhere.
Remember how she was saying buy Canadian? She sounds like she is a saleswoman for the Chinese car manufacturers now. So you're going to be putting these incentives, these taxpayer-funded incentives for people to buy electric vehicles, but at the same time, everybody knows that the Chinese EVs are going to be undercutting them. And you're saying, oh, we're going to have all these cheap EVs. So is it buy Canadian or is it buy China? What is it? I think we know the answer.
And I take the point about the economics of again, trying to diversify, make EVs more affordable. But I see no evidence, unless you do, that China is a less disruptive global power. And your government has made decisions now to open a market that you have, talked about how important it is to the Canadian economy, open up a market to Chinese investments in the auto sector, to open up more Chinese investment in oil and gas, for example, another critical asset for Canada. Is that a mistake given your own assessment of China just a few short years ago?
Well, I think things have changed. When you make assessments, it's based also on the context in which you're making them. And the U.S. has decided to change its course when it comes to trade. And Canadian auto workers are the first victims of that. And so, of course, we'll continue to seek a good agreement with the U.S. and with Mexico. We will obviously put a lot of time and efforts in the renewal and revision of the CUSMA agreement. But at the same time, the negotiations that we've had with China have been more predictable and much more stable than the experience we've had with the U.S. And that's a statement I made a month ago, and I stand by my statement, because we're not the only ones experiencing that. Ask the question to Europeans, ask the questions to the Japanese, ask the question to the Koreans. They're experiencing the same reality as we are.
Don't you think, though, with respect, Minister, that that's by design by China, that they see the world as it is right now and want to seize on the moment for less than altruistic purposes?
Ladies and gentlemen, that was a very polite way of Vassy saying to Mark Carney and Melanie Joly, "Are you stupid?" I don't know if I've ever seen that before from Vassy and CTV. Well played. Are you stupid? Like, that's what that translates into. Are you stupid? Are you stupid? Are you naive? Or do you know exactly what's going on? Maybe all three.
Well, it's up for them to answer that question. Our approach will be always to defend our national interests, to defend basically our workers, to create opportunities here in the country. And so we're always reacting to what is happening in the White House, and that was certainly our approach in 2025. But Vassy, I must say, in 2026, we have a plan, and we're implementing it. And so we won't be always just waiting to see what will happen. We need to be able to be in charge of our own destiny. That's why we came up with this new auto strategy, and that is why we know there's lots of change. We know that that can be very stressful for families across those working in across the auto sector, but we will support them, and we will accompany them as we're embracing this change, and we will make sure that we're creating new jobs. And you know what? That's what happened in the 80s. In the 80s, the D3 were shutting down plants across Ontario and Quebec. It was really difficult. I still have memories of the closure of GM in Sainte-Thérèse, Quebec. And you know what happened? The government at the time, the progressive conservatives of Brian Mulroney, decided to go to Japan and attract Japanese automakers. And now where are we? 77% of our auto production is Honda and Toyota. So that's why we're looking at other options. Germany, Korea, China, and that's what we need to do, because we cannot be just stuck in the same approach.
I understand it. I guess I would just quickly point out Japan and China are definitely not the same kind of world actor. But
so just so everybody knows, Melanie Joly was born in 1979. So I'm sure you remember an auto plant closing during the 80s. Sure you do. And second, Vassy took the words right out of my mouth. You're comparing talking to Japan versus talking to communist China. Right. I don't think you need to say anything else to that. But someone who did say something else was Kyle Seaback when he commented on what was going on with this new announcement. Very interesting.
Well, I think, first of all, I looked at those statements and it's pretty weak sauce. None of them are like bullish, like this is fantastic. But here's the problem. Right now, as you talked about, we have 10% tariffs on all vehicles that we export to the United States. And what is going to happen with this zero emission vehicle subsidy rebate is that American-made vehicles are actually going to be the primary beneficiary of these, because less than 5% of the vehicles we manufacture in Canada actually will qualify for this rebate. So it's really strange when the Americans are tariffing our vehicles and we are actually, in effect, subsidizing theirs. Like, imagine if you were a Brampton auto worker who was supposed to be building the Jeep Compass EV, and that was transferred to the United States, right? The production is going to be there. And the taxes that those workers paid into the system are going to be used to give subsidies for people that buy those vehicles. So look, I think if you're an auto worker in Canada, you're not very happy with this because so few are going to benefit from it.
So this is interesting because this was kind of the narrative that they were talking about in question period. And this explains it. So what they're saying is that only about 5% of the EVs in Canada are going to qualify for these rebates, right? Because that's just how it's working. But most of them are actually going to be coming from the States. So the States ships these cars in, they're going to be EVs, and those companies are going to be given money by the government as the incentives to actually have customers buy those EVs. And then that money contributes to the profit margin of the United States auto manufacturers. Good job, Liberals. So you have taxpayer money going out of Canada's economy over to the United States. And at the same time, you're allowing communist China, state subsidized audio manufacturers with documented, proven spyware systems coming into the to Canada. What the hell is going on?
You made 2 points, though, when you started off. Initially, it was being critical of the idea that the Americans would benefit from this, right? And at the
Yes.
same time, you just said you haven't been able to remove those tariffs that exist in the first place. And again, I'll sort of circle back to where I started, which is if we said to everybody, hey, we're going to give these rebates to everyone but you, the United States, do you think that the White House would be more likely to remove the tariffs?
I don't know. It's hard to speculate if that's going to be the case. You know, President Trump's very unpredictable. We know this. So going in with something that could be beneficial, it might not be. But what we go back to is, as it's designed right now, when Donald Trump has put tariffs on Canadian vehicles, that is very clearly hurting our Canadian auto workers and Canadian auto production. Why would this have been designed to exclude them from the get-go? Like, why are most of these subsidies going to be used to purchase vehicles that are manufactured in the United States, including the Jeep Compass EV, which was supposed to be manufactured in Brampton? So,
do you really think explicitly the purpose of this was to just benefit the Americans? Like, I think that, you know, wouldn't the unions and the car companies and all of them be saying that right now if that were the case?
Well, look, I think that this is the unintended consequence of a very poorly thought out policy. I don't think they thought this through. In fact, I think the Chinese EVs that are coming in, 50,000 worth, right, tariff-free, plus the subsidy
Not
of
tariff-free,
other
reduced tariffs,
the new subsidies now. This is to shore up the Liberal Party's green base. It is not to actually help Canadian auto workers. You know, the Liberals have moved more and more towards the Conservatives on every issue, and they're worried about losing support on their environmental flank. So these policies are designed to shore that up, but at the expense of Canadian auto workers. They could take the industrial carbon tax off to help auto workers as well. There's so many levers that they could do to do this, but instead they're doing something that I think primarily benefits themselves in keeping their base together and the people that want to buy EVs.
That's a really interesting point that Seaback brings up. And I think he's hit a bullseye there. Because as we've been saying, the NDP leadership race is going to be coming to a close the end of next month. We're in February now. It's amazing because it started way back in the fall. So it's coming to a close at the end of next month. The Liberals have to be conscious of the NDP pulling environmentalists away from them. The environmentalists already have this illusion, thank you, Liberals, that the Liberals are becoming less environmentally conscious because of the alleged MOU pipeline, even though anyone with, half a brain understands what that actually is. And that this is a way for them to create the illusion that they are still environmentally conscious and trying to keep that voting bloc. So that's really interesting. And it really just, it makes everybody think that an election is coming. And the more people we talk about inside the political apparatus, the more people are like, We've actually had one person tell us that they believe that an election is going to be called mid-April, shortly after the NDP race. We'll see if that comes to pass or not. But we're seeing more and more signs and more talking points from the Liberals, and the justification that they seem to be kind of building a base for is the Conservatives are obstructionists and they're preventing them from executing their agenda. Remember we said this back in C5. Everyone was crapping on us for our narrative about C5 and why the Conservatives had to vote for it and had to pass it. Because Carney would have used that as justification to call an election and say the Conservatives are obstructing him and preventing him from executing the mandate that Canadians gave him. But they passed C5. Gutted it, but passed it. And so all you're hearing from the Liberals now are Conservatives are obstructing, which is pretty crazy. Like, they're not obstructing anything. What they were doing is trying to get the Liberals to talk about Bill C-14, the bail and reform, versus the, religious censorship bill, Bill C-9. But this is where this seems to be going, folks. So Carney is capitulating on some of these key things, trying to win back support of the auto unions. But I don't know if he's going to be able to actually get that support back. That might be gone. That might be in the Conservatives' pocket at this point. Because once you've been screwed that badly by the Liberal Party, how can you go back? Never mind the fact that the unions are still losing jobs. GM plant laid off 1,200 auto workers the other day. And this isn't bringing jobs back. That's the thing. So those people that lost their jobs, they're not getting them back as a result of these, EV subsidies. But the U.S. auto manufacturers, they're rubbing their hands together on this one, let me tell you.